Welcome back to the Saturday Scholars College Football Podcast. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. That is Gonzo. That is Xan. I am Shoob. The trio is here and we are ready to go. ACC win totals part 1. Are you guys fired up?
Why wouldn't we be, man? We're back with ZKS. I think it's a good day. We got the full team today.
I'm glad to be on. I'm absolutely stoked for this.
Let's go. ACC, it's going to be an interesting conference this year. I think there's 2 teams, and then there's the rest. At least that's the perception. Maybe perhaps there's some other contenders out there. We'll see. There's a lot to look and dive into with this conference. But without further ado, boys, let's get going.
When I looked at this being 8.5, I said to myself, no way, no how. That is an easy under. But then I opened my handy dandy notebook and I did a little bit of research. I did a little bit of digging.
The Texas Longhorns, a team that perennially underachieves. Are you telling me they are going to go 10-2 or are they going to go 8-4?
Get the dang police out there because it's going to be animal cruelty what they're going to put this Buffalo through this season. Thank God that certain things are legal in Colorado because you're going to need a lot of that to watch this team.
ACC win totals starting at the top. The Clemson Tigers come in with a win total of 10 wins even.
Well, it's no secret that Clemson is once again going to be one of the better teams in the ACC this year and is certainly a contender. But let's go ahead and look at why. My biggest thing for them is they brought in Garrett Riley from TCU. So Clemson last year was really strong defensively, 8th in defensive efficiency, but 49th in offensive efficiency, had a lot of struggles, maybe a bit of QB play, maybe a bit of scheme, who knows? But the thing is, they brought in Garrett Riley. There's very good pedigree there. And, coming off a TCU national championship team, hey, that's only improvement there. And I really like what I see from the Tigers. In terms of net TARP rating, they're kind of more intermediate. They're only plus 0.5, so nothing substantial there. But their offensive line, 61st in sack rate, 12th in line yards, it's all right. It's all right. Sack rate, they're good at protecting Klubnik, but even though they're good at protecting Klubnik and DJU and anyone who was in the backfield, they still struggled in the passing game. Quite a bit at times. Klubnik himself only had 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions with 700 yards passing. A little bit of a struggles for Klubnik. Definitely something that I think we can see improvement with Garrett Riley now as his OC. And so I think there is potential there. That was one of the big question marks I had with Clemson is how is Cade Klubnik going to look this season? And I'm going to go ahead and bet that Garrett Riley does something that is going to play to his strengths and that they will improve offensively. So I like that for Clemson. Will Shipley returns, another big key component. Basically, they're little Christian McCaffrey, and then they have Antonio Williams returning. So another person that could potentially have a blow-up year this year. And then 2 of the more impactful offensive linemen are returning, but they lost their best tackle in Jordan McFadden to the NFL. So that's something to be on the lookout for. I expect slight O-line regression, but they should still hold relative to what they were last year. Overall, man, I mean, when you look at the ACC as a whole, Clemson still has one of the better teams from top to bottom. Roster talent can't be denied. Adding one of the Riley brothers is just a huge thing for me. So on the defensive side of the ball, Clemson returns cornerback Nate Wiggins, who was their best defender, basically, pass defender. And then Sheridan Jones also returns, although Sheridan Jones struggled a little bit in pass coverage last season. RJ Mickens returns, who was a good coverage safety. So the secondary will be a pretty decent spot this season. Looking at their linebackers, the next level, they lost Trenton Simpson, but they're bringing back Jeremiah Trotter and Barrett Carter, both absolute studs, and both are actually rated very highly in pass coverage, believe it or not. So they are going to be one of the more formidable offenses against some of these teams that can pass the ball a little bit. UNC, Florida State potentially. So they have some versatility there. They lost Ryan Bercy on the D line and two other and return two capable interior linemen in Tyler Davis and Rook Orohoro. So that's just a bonus to their defensive line. I think their run defense is still going to be pretty solid, and I think their pass defense will be pretty good considering that they have some help from the linebackers at that second level. There are some concerns for me from some of the corners on their team, but overall, I think the linebackers are going to take away the middle of the field pretty well. So you're going to have to beat Clemson on the outside if you want to beat them through the air. Now that we've looked at all of this, coaching, I think they have far and away made the best hire this offseason. And their line is sitting there at 10. So let's look at their schedule. First week is at Duke. That's not a cakewalk, and that's not a guaranteed win because Duke is actually a pretty solid team this year when we consider the ACC. But this is Clemson. I'm going to say they beat Duke. No disrespect to Duke. Charleston Southern, W. Florida Atlantic, W. FSU is a tricky one, but they are very lucky in that they play FSU at home. That game may end up being the ACC championship game. So we'll say that one can go either way. At Syracuse, W. Wake Forest, W. Bye week to prepare for Miami. And because they get that bye week to prepare for Miami, I think they're going to come out with the W. W against NC State. I'm going to say Notre Dame gets them after the NC State game. But then Georgia Tech win, UNC win. South Carolina is a possible. They lost to South Carolina last year. So definitely can see South Carolina with Spencer Rattler returning. They were kind of firing on all cylinders last year. South Carolina could be a team to look out for and a team that could potentially upset Clemson. So based on what I'm looking at here, I'm seeing about 2 losses, but Clemson could win one of those 2 games. And I think it's more likely, let me just say this, I think they're going to go 10-2. But I think it's more likely that they win an extra game than they lose an extra game. So I'm going with the Clemson over at 11-1.
Xan, I'm inclined to agree with you. With these Clemson Tigers, I am pushed to over. I see 10-2 here. The fact that the Clemson Tigers, in addition to bringing in one of the best offensive minds in the game right now, all their difficult games are at home. That is amazing. And I think between FSU early in the year, keep in mind, Notre Dame, and UNC, the fact that you get all those at home, I just don't see how you lose 2 of those 3. You've got room to lose a Notre Dame game and still be completely in the driver's seat to win the ACC. Just to expand on the personnel a bit that you masterfully laid out for us of how Clemson will be operating this season. I think Bo Collins, Adam Randall, Cole Turner, seeing how Klubnik can utilize them with Riley pulling the strings is going to be very exciting. And I also think that the depth that Xavier Thomas and former 5 stars Peter Woods, Vic Burley, both who are incoming freshmen, by the way, and Page provide is just going to give us another stout Clemson D-line and is going to feast on a lot of O-lines in the ACC. And I do just want to say for caution that with their O-line, as great as their O-lines typically are, there is a little cause for concern at center. If they lose Will Putnam, that could slightly derail what I think will be an offensive juggernaut in this conference. So in sum, this is easily 10-2, and they're going to be very exciting to watch again as they get their offensive identity back on track.
So we got 2 overs in the room so far on Clemson. Well, I agree with most about everything that you guys said. I'm pretty much in the same boat as you guys. I think 10-2 is the most likely outcome for this year. But I'm actually going to take a little bit of a turn here that you guys may have not expect. I am 10-2, but I'm going under, boys. A lean under, very, very lean under. I have my numbers at like 9.78, 9.8 to be more specific. So, which is a very lean under. I'm not very confident in this one at all. When I went into this win total, I did this breakdown. I was actually kind of expecting to put a little green arrow next to Clemson's name, but what it really boils down to me for, what's the biggest question in the room is how much of a difference is Garrett Riley at OC? How much of a difference is he actually going to make? When that hire happened, that was one of the bigger hires that happened early in the offseason last year. I was like, wow, that may have just saved Clemson, or I should say Dabo may have just saved himself and Clemson from another joke of an offense going into next year. And that may have just saved himself an ACC title, perhaps, because of the ascent of Florida State. But when you dig more under the hood on Cade Klubnik, I don't know. It's really tough to say because his best game was against North Carolina, but North Carolina last year was a very bad defense. They were one of the worst defenses in all of FPS. They were literally the worst defense in the ACC, and that was who Klubnik played in the ACC championship game. So he feasted on a really bad defense. And then when you look at his games against Tennessee and some of his other games that he played, if you look at the numbers under the hood, they're not really all that great. And I know obviously Klubnik has that upside potential, and Garrett Riley is probably going to get the most out of him, I would assume. It's still a little bit of a question mark for me. Like, I didn't go into this breakdown thinking, hey, I might want to pump the brakes on Cade Klubnik a little bit here, but I don't know. There's a little bit of a red flag for me, just a minor red flag there for me, despite the great offensive coordinator hire in Garrett Riley. And as far as the defense, man, I don't know. The defensive line, that losing Miles Murphy and Brian Breesy, that's pretty tough. Even though they are going to reload, that is pretty tough. I expect a loss in production there. Love the linebacker room though. I mean, Jeremiah Trotter and Barrett Carter, that's probably arguably the best linebacker duo in the entire country. And as far as the schedule, what I do like for Clemson is that they kind of have a little bit of an easier ramp up to the Florida State game, because I don't know what it is about the ACC, but they always seem to schedule their biggest games. There always seems to be like one or two like big games we peg earlier in the year in the preseason. We're like, oh yeah, that game might decide who wins the ACC right there or goes to the championship game. And it's always early in the year. And this year it's Clemson versus Florida State. I will say I agree with you, Xan. I think they got to be careful going at Duke. Riley Leonard might be able to light them up there. I would be cautious there. But it is nice that they have those games at home. But if you look at the schedule holistically here, I think that they actually kind of got a little bit of a bad draw when it comes to ACC play, because they play a lot of the higher rated teams in the ACC conference. They don't play a lot of the lower rated teams. I think the worst ACC team that they play is Georgia Tech. They don't play Virginia. They don't play Virginia Tech. They play some of the middle tier to upper teams in the ACC. I actually think it's low-key kind of a difficult schedule. And that's not to mention the fact that they got to play Notre Dame, granted at home, and then they got to go at South Carolina, who they lost to last year. So when it comes to Clemson, I mean, I don't know. I'm saying that 9-3 is a little bit more likely than 11-1. I'm not completely buying what the Garrett Riley offseason hire hype has been selling to me, which I did not expect it to come to that conclusion when we first started here. So I'm going very lean under on Clemson.
Those are very valid points, Shoob, and I really like the way that you articulated that. And hey, it's very plausible for it to go underneath based on what you said, that they play a lot of those middle teams and the higher rated teams in the ACC. So there could be a slip up somewhere, especially if they don't make it out of those two big games, FSU and Notre Dame. But I'm going to go ahead and say my money is with Garrett Riley and what they did with that TCU offense and finding a way to at least improve upon Klubnik. And that's why I'm going to stick with my guns there.
So anyways, I think it's time to move on here. How about their counterparts down south in Tallahassee, the Florida State Seminoles? You want to talk about a hype train, a dark horse hype train? That is the Florida State Seminoles. Mike Norvell heading into his fourth season at FSU. He has the ball rolling, to say the least. Gonzo lead us off on the Noles, sitting there with a line at 9.5.
Thank you, Shoob. I'm not going to hide the ball here. I debated over this for a solid 10 minutes before finally coming to the conclusion that I think the Florida State Seminoles will win over 9.5 games. Let me get into the personnel first before I break down the schedule. You got Jordan Travis coming back at quarterback. You know, people are already talking about him as a preseason Heisman contender. And I was there in New Orleans. I saw what he did. That boy can play. He's a solid quarterback. And in these kind of 4th, 5th year opportunities for quarterbacks like Travis, I'm expecting him to do very well. With his receivers, I mean, I do have some questions. I know Johnny Wilson is going to be the guy, and he's 6'7", but the problem is he just hasn't been consistent in regards to catching the ball. In fact, a big gripe that my father would have with Johnny was that he would have stone hands and not come down with passes. But that being said, I mean, they're bringing in Hakeem Williams. That was a huge get for them in this past year's recruiting class. So I'm curious to see how much playing time Williams gets. In addition, Deuce Spann, you know, Illinois, a dynasty hero. He comes back. to serve as
That's
another
right.
option on the outside, along with
Shout out the
Podier.
Dynasty followers. Sorry, I
Oh,
had to throw that in
got
there.
to.
Shout out the Dynasty
Absolutely.
followers if you guys listening to this.
Deuce fan, amazing. And what I do like their tight end room. Jaheim Bell from South Carolina, I thought was a great get. And I remember that LSU was in the running to try and poach Kyle Morlock from Shorter. So FSU being able to land him, I think, was awesome for the dual tight end sets that Norvell likes to run. In regards to their offensive line, they got 4 returning starters and then again landed a very touted transfer with Jeremiah Byers from UTEP. So that's going to shore up the line, give some depth. They've line a little bit of other depth coming in. Casey Roddick coming in from Colorado, Keandre Jones from Auburn. Again, those are just depth pieces right there. The line defensively, they do lose Derek McClendon the second, Robert Cooper to the portal, and Leonard Warner third to the draft, though he was kind of one of those hybrids. But I still think with Jared Verse coming back, Fabian Lovett, and what's that? Another transfer from Braden Fisk from Western Michigan. Again, another guy that I remember LSU was in the mix for. You get those guys coming in to shore up the line. You got all of your linebackers coming back in some solid depth behind them, though they are kind of on the younger side. And then, oh my goodness, what is this? Another transfer. You get Fentrell Cypress, an interconference transfer coming in from Virginia to play corner and go counterpart to Renardo Green on the outside. And I am concerned because after them, it is a lot of freshmen, but all in all, that's going to be an awesome defensive unit, in my opinion. And then just to break down the schedule real quick, that LSU game, that is a toss-up. They win that, they're in really good shape. So that's going to be a toss-up. And I think Clemson on the road will be that toss-up. And maybe Miami later in the year will be a toss-up. But depending where Miami's headspace at and it being at Doak, I like the Noles' chances in that game. So those are my 3 big kind of coin flip games for them. But yes, I am leaning over with the Noles.
Gotcha. Over at 9.5 on the Noles. Well, if you FSU fans are watching, you can see my shirt here. Yeah, that's right. I wore it. College World Series today. We won game 2. Go Gators, by the way. But I'm going to give you guys an objective analysis here. For those of you listening on the pod, I'm wearing a Florida Gators shirt, by the way. That's my alma mater. But I promise I'm very objective here when it comes to these breakdowns. And I'm liking what I'm seeing from Florida State. So you highlighted a lot of stuff there, Gonzo. The offense was really good last year, man. In fact, I think the offense was kind of underrated. I know Florida State got a lot of hype and a lot of people saw the ascension last year, but I don't think a lot of people realized if you look at the numbers, if you look at the analytics, FSU's offense was very good. It was 8th last year in total efficiency. They were number 1 in the ACC in yards per play, and that was by a huge margin. Florida State averaged 7 yards per play offensively. That's really good numbers right there. Those are elite offensive numbers. And you highlighted a lot of the transfer additions. This is the one thing that Mike Norvell did with the transfer portal. He didn't just bring in quantity, because you'll see some guys will bring in quantity. They'll just be depth pieces. Norvell brought in quantity and quality. It was insane. You look at this transfer portal class here for Florida State, the quality of depth and the quality at the top is just insane. I think it's easily the best transfer class in the country. I don't care what you have to say about Colorado. I'm looking at quality and quantity here with FSU's transfer portal class. And the offensive line progression, the offensive line, it was only a few years ago, Florida State fans, you guys remember this. Florida State's offensive line was a complete disaster, and I mean legitimately a disaster. They had the worst offensive line in the Power 5. That's inexcusable if you're Florida State. The offensive line progression under Norvell this year has been really good. Very impressive, in my opinion. The progression of Jordan Travis just as a quarterback's been very good. And I think Norvell has done a really good job here, and he's turned things around really quickly. So when it comes to the schedule here, I kind of look at this line at 9.5, and then I look at the schedule. This is how I see it. Florida State's going to be favored in 10 of their 12 games. So the line's sitting there at 9.5. They're going to be favored in 10 of their 12 games off the bat there. So that's already over 9.5 games that they're favored in. And then you look at the LSU game, and then you look at the at Clemson game, both of those early in the year. They split those games. That's 11-1 right there. Let's say you go pessimistic here and you say they lose to LSU and then they lose to Clemson. 0-2 in those games. I could see them easily running the table the rest of that schedule. There may be a hiccup there, but I'm going to say it is far more likely that FSU gets the over here at 9.5. And if I'm an FSU fan, I'm buying the hype right now. I went into this skeptical, but with the quality additions and from the transfer portal, it is just hard not to see the absolute progression from last year to this year, which, at first going to the offseason, I was thinking, the hype train's a little too steamy on this one, but I think it's legit. I think Florida State's the best team in the ACC. I think they're better than Clemson. And hey, another point too. Let's say they lose to Clemson in the regular season. That doesn't mean they might not have a second shot at them in the ACC title game. Let's keep in mind here, I forgot to mention the ACC doesn't have divisions anymore. So we could very well see a rematch between Florida State and Clemson. They don't necessarily have to win that regular season game, but if they can win that rematch game, that's obviously huge for them.
And historically, a rematch usually favors the loser.
Good point, Shoob. I'm with you with a lot of those things you said with FSU. Very impressive last year. They finally took that step that FSU fans have been waiting for forever, since they had been in such turmoil since Jimbo left the program in disarray all those years ago. I mean, last year, 8th in offensive efficiency, number 36 defensive efficiency, 38th in line yards, 44th in sack rate, with a positive 4.5 net tarp rating. They're poised for a good season. Not to mention the good additions to the O-line, as Zach alluded to, not to mention the good additions to the offensive line, as Gonzo alluded to, which is going to give them a good unit. So I really like this man, Jordan Travis. He improved in his passing. He's a true dual threat guy that can take you deep if you don't watch him. They may have lost Treshaun Moore to Kansas State, but they also have Trey Benson, who's also a beast. He averaged 6.5 yards a carry. I mean, that dude's an absolute stud. And then to touch up on the receivers, I mean, you guys mentioned Johnny Wilson. I love him, 6'7". And then Keon Coleman from Michigan State. Absolutely love it. They're absolutely stacked in addition to the other transfers they got at the tight end position. The offense is going to be quite formidable. Fentrell Cypress, as you mentioned, love it. But Fentrell Cypress is the only guy in that secondary who has a high pass coverage rating. Across from him, I know you mentioned Renardo Green. Renardo Green actually has a terrible pass coverage rating. He's more of a great run support corner. Very interesting stuff there. So there will, as FSU's defense will be good, but there will be holes in their secondary. That's the only thing. They are susceptible to being beat through the air. And they also lost Jamie Robinson to the NFL, who is another safety of theirs. So there is certainly some weaknesses that they've taken to their secondary. Now, I love the D-line. You touched on that, so I'm not even going to go into that. That's my only concern. The secondary is good, but maybe there are some holes there where they can get beat. This is a good team. I'm with both of you guys. FSU over LSU. Look, I know it's 9.5. LSU, whether they win that game or not, I'm still on this over, man. Say they even lose to FSU. Southern Miss is a win. Boston College a win. At Clemson, could be a win. But even if they lose that, Virginia Tech, Syracuse, Duke, Wake, Pitt, Miami, North Bama, Florida could be tricky at the end of the year because Florida gave them a hell of a game last year. It's a rivalry. So I'm saying if FSU actually, let me backtrack a little bit. If FSU wants to hit this over, they have to win either the LSU or the Clemson game, or they are running the risk. Because, I mean, Duke is formidable. Florida is formidable, and we don't know what we're going to see from Miami to their full extent just yet. Miami has improved, but what are they going to do? Because that coaching staff has yet to prove that they can do anything with the talent that they have. So they need to take either this LSU or this Clemson game to get this over. If they lose both of those, this over is done. But I am on the over.
All right, so three-way consensus here with the Florida State over 9.5 wins. You love to see it if you're a Noles fan. Hey, this is going to be very interesting. Right now, it seems like it's a two-horse race between Clemson and FSU, but we're about to get into the nitty-gritty here. Maybe perhaps there's another contender that's lurking down there in this conference. We're about to get into that.
Shoo, I mentioned Florida State. They've got an improved defense, but they will have some holes in the secondary. Well, let's get into North Carolina, Shoob. I know you want to start us off with North Carolina, with Drake May and North Carolina sitting there at 8.5. How do you feel about them, man? Do you think that they can contest FSU or North Carolina this year?
Well, I'll put it this way. I think Drake May is one of those guys that can expose Florida State's weakness. That is for sure. He can light up a secondary. Drake May, I mean, that guy He's my number 2 pick in the draft overall behind Caleb Williams. I think it's 1A, 1B. But North Carolina, very fortunate to have an elite quarterback on their hands in Drake May. But with that being said, let's look at this team holistically here. Mac Brown, he's in his 5th season, believe it or not, at North Carolina, in his second stint, by the way. His second stint at UNC, for those of you who don't know that, he used to coach there back in the day. But UNC kind of had a little bit of a moderately disappointing season last year, 9-5 after what looked like potentially a team that could win the ACC and challenge Clemson. The defense obviously was a huge Achilles heel for this team, but Drake May and the offense really carried this team, and they got to the ACC championship game, and they'll try to see if they can take that next step this year. The offense, very good, 17th overall in offensive efficiency last season. They were second in the ACC in yards per play offensively as well. I already mentioned Drake May. One thing that's a little bit of a red flag here is that they lose wide receiver Josh Downs, who accounted for 27% of the team's total receptions. One receiver accounted for over a quarter of the team's total receptions. Now, if you're not familiar with the stat breakdowns there, that's usually pretty rare. Josh Downs was a huge, important target there for Drake May. He had more than double the amount of receptions than the second leading receiver on the entire team. So let's put it that way. So they lose Josh Downs, but they did bring in stud wide receiver Devontae Walker from Kent State, who was a 95 grade 4-star on 247. So Devontae Walker potentially could take over that role and fill those shoes that Josh Downs left going into this season. And then let's not to mention the play caller behind the madness here. Former offensive coordinator Phil Longo, he left for Wisconsin to join Fickell and the staff there in Madison. They bring in new offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey from UCF, a very interesting hire there. So we'll see how Drake may adjust. We've seen this happen where there's a coordinator change and all of a sudden things don't look right the next season, or maybe they get a lot better. It's kind of hard to tell here. I'm interested to hear your guys' opinion on this in a few moments here, but we'll see with Chip Lindsey versus Phil Longo how you guys feel about that difference at offensive coordinator. But before we get there, I mean, it's the elephant in the room that's got to be addressed. The defense. I mean, gosh, like, come on, UNC, man. Mac Brown, I'm sorry, but Gene Chizik has been retained as the defensive coordinator. North Carolina fans, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but Gene Chizik needs to go. That guy should not be a defensive coordinator. I mean, you're wasting a ton of talent on the defensive self, and not to mention you're wasting the opportunity of having one of the top quarterbacks in the entire country and a quarterback that's going to go in the top of the NFL draft right here in Drake May. You're wasting that by having this atrocious defense. 116th last year in offensive efficiency, one of the worst in all of FPS. They gave up 6.1 yards per play, which was dead last in the ACC conference. They returned 8 starters, however, so we'll see if maybe there's some room for improvement here. The D-line was 114th last year in line yards, and they were 130th out of 131 teams in sack rate. North Carolina had the second worst defensive line in all of FBS when it came to sacking the quarterback. That is just inexcusable if you are UNC. However, I do like linebacker Cedric Gray. He's a solid player that's returning, so there is some potential on this defense. There is some star talent on this defense, but that talent has clearly not been tapped into. And as far as the schedule here for North Carolina, they open up against the Gamecocks at Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte, so a neutral site game there. This non-conference schedule is actually a little bit tricky here. You got South Carolina, then you got Appalachian State, and then Minnesota. So if I'm UNC here, you know, I could see them, worst case scenario, maybe going 1-2 in these games. I could see them dropping to South Carolina. I could see them dropping to Minnesota. In fact, this team almost nearly lost to Appalachian State last year. Appalachian State was a wide open receiver in the end zone on a 2-point conversion away from beating UNC last year. So if you're UNC, you got to be careful here. I could see them winning all 3 of these games. I could see them potentially losing all 3 of these games. Very high variance here with this non-conference slate to open the year. Then they go at Pitt. They have a bye week. And then we get into the thick of ACC play here. The end of it is a little bit tough there. I don't like the fact that they end the season with Duke. Then they go at Clemson and at NC State. So if you're UNC, you want to be able to rack up those wins against the teams like Syracuse and Virginia and Georgia Tech and Campbell towards the middle of the schedule. But I could see this being a team that could get off to a slow start and rack up some L's. So when we get down to business here with this line at 8.5, this is what it boils down to for me. How much will the new offensive coordinator Chip Lindsey matter, and how much will losing Josh Downs affect the offense? We don't want to see Drake May take a Tyler Van Dyke dip like this year, like Van Dyke did last year. That's the worst case scenario. If you're a UNC fan, the defense probably won't be that much better. If I'm going to be honest, I know they do return a lot of guys, but it's guys that also sucked last year. And it's also a defensive coordinator that's terrible. That's calling the plays. Like I don't really see that much room for improvement if we're just keeping the same staff and the same guys that were terrible last year. Believe it or not, my numbers here have UNC projected for just under 6 wins. Just under 6 wins. That's not a typo. They were 5-2 in one possession games last year. They did get kind of lucky in one score games last year. I mentioned the App State game. Easily could have lost that. A few other games they could have lost last year that they won. I am a fat, and I repeat, fat under for UNC. I am very confident that the Tar Heels are not going to get to 9 wins. And it's not a knock on Drake May. It's a knock on the coaching staff for really wasting Drake May's talent, in my opinion. I do not have a lot of faith in this coaching staff's ability to get the most out of this team. I'll put it that way. I am a heavy under here at 8.5 wins for UNC. I see only 6 to 7 wins. If they get to 8, great. That's still an under. So that's what I got to say.
Well, Shoob, very bold take, very bold, and it makes a lot of sense, honestly. They don't have the most favorable schedule, and their defense is still horrendous. Since you asked about what we think about the new hire at offensive coordinator for Chip Lindsey, well, let's just say this. Chip Lindsey was 32nd in offensive efficiency at UCF last season. He took a quarterback in John Reese Plumlee, who was flailing in his career, could not find any consistency at Ole Miss, and then actually had a pretty good year at UCF last year. So I think it shows, or at least it's a sample size that shows that Chip Lindsey can get the best out of his players, or at least design his offense around his players' skill. So I think that's something that bodes well for North Carolina. So I don't think there will be too significant of a drop off there. We'll see. Only time will tell, unfortunately. The TARP rating for them, man, I know you mentioned they have a lot returned. Their TARP rating's plus 10.5, which is one of the best in all of college football. Offensive efficiency 17th last year. And as you mentioned, you alluded to it, defense 116th, absolutely atrocious. And then line yards, sack rate, both 89th. Absolutely atrocious offensive line. Can you imagine this? An atrocious offensive line, that bad, and Drake May is still this good? That's just crazy to me. Like, he basically has no one blocking for him, and he's still this good. I know you don't like the loss of Josh Downs, but I do want to point out that they added Devontae Walker from Kent State in the portal, and he brings about 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns of production. And they also added Nate McCollum from Georgia Tech, who I think is an undervalued transfer. I think he has some upside as well, but wasn't properly utilized at Georgia Tech. So I think Drake May's got some weapons this year to definitely supplement the loss of Josh Downs. So I'm not too concerned about that. I am concerned about their O-line. They return a lot. Look, they have a lot of upperclassmen. They return most of their guys, but the O-line is terrible. It's not really going to get any better. They didn't bring anyone significant in that really stands out to me. They did add Willie Lampkin from Coastal. Maybe he'll slide in there and be a decent addition to make the O-line slightly better. But I'm not expecting a whole miracle from the offensive line standpoint. Maybe a slight improvement. In terms of defense, man, look, the defense is bad, but get a load of this. They lost a ton of people from their secondary. They lost Storm Duck to Penn State, Tony Grimes to Texas A&M, and Cam Kelly to Virginia. They lost 3 key secondary pieces. They at least added Elijah Huzzy from Eastern Tennessee, and he's one of the most coveted cover corners in all of college football, believe it or not. He has one of the highest grades per PFF in pass coverage. But ultimately, even when you add that, I still think you took a net loss there with all the people that left your program. So I'm expecting their secondary to be worse than it was last year. And their secondary was already horrendous. Now, I've already made my picks on this and made my bed, but the more I talk about this, the more I wish I could go the other direction. But I'm going to go ahead and say, man, that I'm just not impressed. Their offense is amazing, but you can't win if you can't get off the field, or if your defense is getting burned so quickly, your offense is just having to play keep up, Non-con, man, like you said it, I think 2-1 is their best play in non-con. I don't think they'll go 3-0. Could happen, but with their defense the way it is, I don't think they go 3-0 in non-con. 2-1 is their best play in non-con. Then they got at Pitt. I think they'll win that. Then bye week, Syracuse, Miami, Virginia, Georgia Tech, Campbell, Duke, Clemson, NC State. I'm thinking initially here, I'm thinking if they can win 2 of their non-con games, they have a chance to get to 9 wins. But the more and more I think about it, the more I feel like it's an underplay. But since I've already submitted my play for this, I'm going to stick with the over, although I do think the under is very, very likely.
So after all that, we're going with an over on 8.5 for UNC. How about you,
I didn't want to
Gonzo?
mess up your graphic, Shoob.
After hearing both of y'all's educated, insightful takes, it almost has me want to do some backtracking and reconsider.
Oh boy,
But
I got us backtracking on UNC. Man.
I'm always a man of my word, and I ate my words when Tulane came to celebrate that Cotton Bowl win at the state capitol. So I'm going to go over on North Carolina. I'm putting the faith in Drake May, and I'm putting some faith in some coaching additions. We got Freddie Kitchens with that NFL experience, that South Carolina analyst coming in to coordinate the run game, coach up the tight ends. We got Randy Clements and John Cooper being an analyst, Randy Clements coming from North Texas, who was half decent last year, coming in to co-coach that O-line. And then Jason Jones offers something at cornerback coach. He's coming from Indiana, so it's not like that's really much of a better situation talent-wise. But maybe those coaching shakeups, more so Jason Jones, can at least do something to work in conjunction with Gene Chizik being retained. And losing Keyshawn Silver as depth, former 5-star on the D-line, that hurts as well. Xan hit it on the head. I as well had concerns with the secondary depth. But for me, it does come down to schedule. With the non-con, more so Minnesota, I do think that most likely would be a win for UNC. If we're going to do a battle of the QBs, I'm just sold on Drake, of course, more than I am on the Greek Rocket for Minnesota, and we can get into that with Big Ten takes. Miami, I think they can beat Miami at home. They always get these really wonky finishes against the Canes and find a way to gut it out. That Duke game is going to be awesome, and I'm marking that tentatively as a win at home. So if they could just fall on the right side of these coin flip games, maybe they could sneak out 9-3. But if you want like that kind of push the over, 1 out of 35 confidence points on the over, that's where I am. But I'm going over on these heels.
All right. Well, I think it's clear that if you've been listening, that you guys probably are a little less confident on the over now at 8.5 than you were going into it. But I just want to say I do love Drake May, but again, I want to reiterate to North Carolina fans, it's not about Drake May. Chip Lindsey could end up being a great hire. It's really, I'm just such a non-believer in Gene Chizik in the defense.
now, the only thing I'll say is that Caleb Williams somehow carried that atrocious USC defense and made up for them. So that's kind of what I'm banking on with Drake May here, is in a weaker or kind of comparable conference, is that Drake May puts the Caleb Williams shoes on and just wills this team to victory every weekend.
The only difference with USC is they had a lot of turnover luck, which UNC did not have. I mean, USC's turnover ratio was insane. It was absolutely incredible. They were number 1, I think, in forced turnovers. It was either them or Iowa. But
it was USC last year. But anyways, I think it's time to head to Louisville now. They're sitting with a win total of 8 wins, 8.0. Xan, you lead us off here. New head coach Jeff Brom. He's turned Louisville into Purdue South. Take us away on the Cardinals.
He really has. He brought in his brother to be the OC, Brian Brom, who, by the way, was a great quarterback for Louisville. And they bring in the 43rd overall or most efficient offense from Purdue. That's not Louisville's stats. That's from Purdue stats. And then Mark Hagan and Ron English, both coming from Purdue as well. 60th in defensive efficiency for those two. Louisville last year was 57th in offensive efficiency and 14th in defensive efficiency. A lot of people probably didn't know how good Louisville was on defense last year. But look, 48th in line yards, 68th sack rate, +5 in net tarp rating. Pretty solid. And they have number 27 recruiting class coming in. Not bad at all. Definitely something good to start with there. So let's take a look at the roster. Quarterback transfers, Brady Allen versus Cal transfer Jack Plummer. It's probably going to be Jack Plummer. Jack Plummer is a pretty decent starter. I wouldn't call him a bad quarterback. I wouldn't call him a great quarterback. He is a serviceable starter. They return running back Jawar Jordan, 815 yards, about almost 6 yards a carry. Pretty good guy. And then I really like two wide receiver transfers they're bringing in that bring some pizzazz, and that's Jamari Thrash from Georgia State, who had 1,100 yards and 7 touchdowns over at Georgia State, and then Kevin Coleman from Jackson State. I think those are two guys that will add some receiving options for Mr. Plummer. And then they also return one of their best pass blockers, guard Michael Gonzalez, and their best offensive lineman, their center, Brian Hudson. So I really like that they bring back two key components of their offensive line. They also brought in some portal guys to supplement those other positions. So I think at a very base minimum, I think that offensive line will at least hold steady to what it was last year, if not slightly improve. Let's talk about the defense, though. The defense, they lost so much on the defensive side of the ball. They lost linebacker Yasir Abdullah to the NFL, and he is a humongous loss. He was the heart and soul of the Louisville defense, an amazing pass rusher, an amazing run stopper. They lost their defensive lineman, Caleb Banks, to Florida in the transfer portal. They lost their linebacker, Monty Montgomery, to Ole Miss in the transfer portal. So I'm not really all that confident in their linebacker play. There's a lot of their safeties and projected starting corners are not rated very highly against the pass, but they are rated pretty highly against the run. So they're more suited for a good run defense. I expect Louisville to have a pretty decent run defense still, but their pass defense, I think, is going to be their weakness. Look, they did add some corners in the transfer portal, but a lot of these guys are projected to be depth guys, and a lot of them are still very young and developmental pieces aside from Storm Duck from UNC. They also added Marcus Washington from Georgia and Marquise Groves Killebrew from Texas A&M. Two guys who are very athletic and could slot in and develop a little bit, maybe play a little bit more and improve the secondary over time. But overall, I don't think they're going to start off at that point. And then they added safety Devin Neal, who I really like. He came from Baylor, actually, and he's got a little bit of playing experience. We'll see if that improves some things. So there are some upsides to that. But ultimately, I think their secondary is still going to be pretty poor. And they do get an edge rusher who actually, from Stanford, doesn't have a very high transfer portal rating, but PFF thinks very highly of him. And that's Stephen Herron from Stanford. And they think he's a very good pass rusher. So that could be something that, and he's also a projected starter. So that could be something that plays well for Louisville. Ultimately, I think Louisville is going to be very decent. I don't think they're going to be elite. I think they're going to be very serviceable. When we consider the rest of the ACC, I don't think very highly of a lot of teams in this league this year, unfortunately. And just because of that, I think Louisville has a pretty decent shot at this line. Let's look at the schedule. Georgia Tech at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, basically a home game for Georgia Tech, even though it's a neutral site game. We've got Murray State, that's a dub. They play Indiana at Lucas Oil Stadium, and I think that's a win. Boston College, win. At NC State, I think very poorly of NC State this year. I think NC State has taken a dramatic drop this year. I think they beat NC State. Lost to Notre Dame. Pitt is a probable. Bye week. Duke, they could lose that game to Duke. I'm very high on Duke this year. Virginia Tech, I think, is a probable. Virginia, win. Miami, probable. Kentucky, probable. It's too many probable games for me to say that I feel comfortable taking 9 games. I think 8 games is about right, but I think 7 to 8 is much more likely than 9. So I'm going with the Louisville under.
Xan, I'm right there with you. I'm winning under on this team. Now, that's not to say that a first-year head coach with his brand new staff cannot do great things. Literally in Baton Rouge, we just saw LSU go to the SEC championship. But that being said, my concern is just the QB depth. My understanding is that Jack Plummer actually is the guy. He's leading the race, and he's going to be most likely the number one for the season, or at least coming out of spring. And my understanding is that if something is to happen to Plummer, the drop off between him and kind of everybody else in the room is somewhat tremendous. So my main concern throughout the season is just Plummer being able to stay healthy. which that's every team. You need your quarterback to stay healthy, but that's my biggest concern there from a personnel standpoint. And like you said, the defense just losing all their linebackers, but I am still concerned with the depth that they got there. I mean, it's good to bring in. You got Gilbert Freeson coming in from Miami, Keith Brown from Oregon. You got a highly touted freshman in Stanquan Clark, returner Jalen Alderman, TJ Quinn, Jackson Hamilton. But then after those guys, what are you looking at if someone is to get hurt? So my take is, again, really kind of injury based. And that's kind of a cop out because injuries, that's part of the game. But I do think to reach something like 9 wins, Louisville would have to win those toss-up games and stay healthy. And the toss-up games I have are like you just said. I actually do think NC State will be a toss-up game. I have a bit of a different opinion on the Wolfpack, which I'll say coming up. Pitt could be a tossing game because Narduzzi, you get in the mud with Narduzzi, and those rock fights can be absolutely brutal. Duke, toss up, kind of lean loss there potentially. At Miami, they're not going to have the crowd advantage on you, but depending if Miami's invested, that might be tough just from a talent perspective. And same with Kentucky, they always play hard. So I just think Louisville needs more things than not to go right to hit this over. And that's why I'm on the under. But I'm very excited to see what Braum and company do out there in year one. It's going to be really interesting to see.
Gonzo taking a little bit of a page out of the Shoob playbook there with using quarterback depth as a strategy for these win totals. That's my secrets, my trick of the trade is being revealed here. But no, I like that point you made about Plummer. When you look at the raw numbers here, I mean, we talked about it with Pac-12 win totals last week. Xan mentioned this, but Jack Plummer is like as average as it gets. Like when it comes to starting 5 quarterbacks, like Jack Plummer is the guy that is like literally right there in the middle. He is as average as it gets. He's the definition of mid. That's not necessarily a bad thing, by the way. At a program like Louisville, having an average quarterback isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think Jack Plummer, when you look at the raw numbers, he is actually an upgrade over Malik Cunningham in the passing game. In the running game, no, definitely not. Malik Cunningham definitely was dynamic, and overall, it'll probably be a little bit of a step back from what Malik Cunningham was, but at least you get a little bit of an upgrade in the passing game. And then, of course, when he's reuniting with Jeff Braum, his former head coach, probably means that I would expect Plummer to have a little bit better of a season or put up similar numbers like he did back when he was at Purdue with Braum. So it's a very good reunion there in Louisville. I think I agree with you, Xan. I think the defense just has to take a step back. I mean, this defense was 14th last year in defensive efficiency. Very surprising, by the way. I don't think a lot of people really would have expected that. I didn't even really expect that. They very quietly had a very solid defense last year. That is due to take a step back. I don't care who's coaching. And then when you look at the schedule here, one of the things that I'm looking for when it comes to new head coaches is how quickly can you turn over the roster, and then obviously the schedule. Now, when I look at this schedule here, the line's sitting there at 8. I see about 4 or 5 teams that Louisville should be. They should be Georgia Tech, Murray State, Indiana, probably Boston College, probably the Virginia schools as well. So that's 5. After that, I see a lot of toss-ups. I see Kentucky, Miami, Duke, Pitt, Notre Dame, NC State. There's a lot of toss-ups in there. I don't know if this is the roster that can help them win a bunch of those toss-up games and get that edge over the competition. I'm going under here at 8 wins. I see 6 or 7 wins as a little bit more likely. And it's not a lean for me. I think a solid under here for Louisville. They did luck out, though, with the schedule, I will say. Like, Louisville got very lucky. They avoided Clemson. They avoided Florida State, which I don't know how the ACC let that happen, but they avoided the 2 big dogs. But even despite that, I don't see them getting to over 8 wins. And I don't really see this squad competing for the ACC championship, even though they are, believe it or not, I believe they have the 3rd highest odds to win the conference. That is all schedule driven right there, by the way. If you're looking at, you don't really know why. But I'm with you guys here. I'm going under on Louisville, but I love the coaching staff. I just don't think they will get it all put together here super quickly, but we shall see. It's a very good coaching staff. I like the hire there from Louisville. So 3-way consensus on the Louisville under 8 wins. It is time to head down south, about as far south as you can go, to Miami, to Coral Gables. the Miami Hurricanes. Gonzo, lead us off here. They are sitting with a line of 7.5.
The U. For the longest time in my life, I threw that up all the time. I don't know if a lot of listeners know this. Before I attended the University of Florida, and definitely before my days coming to law school at LSU, I was a huge Miami Hurricanes fan, and I think the most they rewarded me with was a 9-win season. And then I got to see them in the Orange Bowl, and Wisconsin beat them by 10 with Hornibrook at quarterback. That aside, the U, this also stands for under. I'm going under 7.5 on the Miami Hurricanes, and let's get into it. You got some coaching changes. Shane Dawson coming in from Houston to replace Josh Gaddis. You know, he only won the Broyles Award. You know, no Gaddis, only had. And then they ran him out after year one. Lance Guidry's coming in to take over DC role, replacing Kevin Steele, who left to go to Alabama. And I guess that's an upgrade maybe. But here's the thing. Even though you're replacing two components that were problems in respective categories for the U, that doesn't sell me, because again, you had Kevin Steele and Charlie Strong, and Strong is a darn good defensive coordinator. You had them co-calling plays for defense, and you had a Broyles winner in Gaddis, and this team still couldn't get it done on the field. So just because you buy a new car does not mean I don't think you're going to have some problems on the road. And let's just do some personnel real quick. I do like Van Dyke, but I'm just interested to see what he does with yet another new offensive coordinator. At receiver, you've got Restrepo returning, which is nice, and you got Tyler Harrell coming in from Bama to give you some outside weapon right there. Then on the O-line, 4 of the 5 starters are gone. And I know that's Cristobal's specialty right there, given that's what he played in college. And he got 2 great recruits, Francis Malagoa and Samson Okunwola. And they're going to be great in like a year or two. I don't think they're going to come in and automatically kill it in that first year. Now, I could be wrong, but I just think that is an adaptation they need to make. But I do like that they got Matt Lee, that UCF transfer in at center. That was a huge get for them. And then moving to the D-line, most of the defense is returning. You got former 5-star Leonard Taylor headlining that, and senior Akeem Mesidor as well. And they did hit the portal hard to get some depth. Branson Dean from Purdue, Thomas Gord from Georgia State, Anthony Campbell from UL Monroe. Again, those are more depth pieces there. And at linebacker, you got, my understanding is like KJ Coyd from Louisville has been killing it, as well as Francis Malagoa from Washington State. And those guys might actually headline your linebacker room right there. And again, they do have some solid depth at backer. And going into the secondary, that's where I have questions on this defensive unit. Is the secondary, by the way, they got torched with Middle Tennessee State last year, and Duke. Don't forget. They lose both their cornerbacks, DJ Ivy and Tyreek Stevenson, to the draft. Though they do have some really good guys at safety: Cam Kinchins, James Williams, who's a former 5-star. But after that, what's going to happen again if there's injuries, and what is that cornerback room looking like? And even with special teams, losing Lou Headley, I'm just curious how that's going to have an impact, because even though we like to laugh at punter, and punter's only funny when he either misses a kick or does a fake, punting is important. And losing a guy like Headley, that is a weapon that is no longer there for them. And then due to schedule real quick, in the Battle of Miami's, I would think they beat Miami of Ohio. I'm leaning loss for Texas A&M if A&M really has their act together. And even so, that game's in Miami, they're still not going to have the crowd. They're not going to have the crowd that Kyle Field had when the U came out there last season. So I think they lose to TAMU. You beat Bethune-Cookman, you beat Temple, you beat Tech. UNC, like I alluded to earlier, on the road. That's a toss-up. I lean UNC because it's on the road. Clemson, I can't even tell you the last time they beat Clemson in my lifetime, maybe 2006. So Clemson's definitely a loss. You beat UVA, you probably beat NC State, and then I think they end the year with 3 straight losses. Yeah, I think they lose to FSU. Coming off that loss, they lose to a Louisville team that I just took an under on, and then you're going to Chestnut. You're going to Chestnut, Massachusetts in November, Thanksgiving weekend. Where's the headspace? We've seen it before. Boston College could beat this team, depending where they're at. If they phoned it in 6-6, we don't care. Boston College could defeat them. So that is a very long-winded way of me saying I am under on the University of Miami this season.
Good points there, Gonzo. So I think when you're looking at what happened to Miami last season, they went 5-7. They didn't even make a bowl game. I think it's fair to say that Miami's season last year, what is about as objectively as you can call a disaster as there is out there. I mean, it kind of seemed like last year was a disaster season for Miami. Ironically enough, the two teams I think that had very similar outcomes were Miami and Texas A&M. Both of them are playing each other in home on homes last year and this year. The difference is when you look under the hood at Texas A&M, I think there's a lot of promise there. When you look under the hood of what happened at Miami, there's a lot of bad and there's a lot of ugly. I don't necessarily think that Cristobal will be able to flush out the problems as quickly as potentially Jimbo Fisher can at Texas A&M. I will say, though, the one good thing, and this is what I like about Cristobal, is that he was not afraid to flush the toilet. He flushed the toilet on his coordinators last year, and that was probably the biggest reason why this Miami team underachieved so poorly last season. He got rid of Josh Gaddis. When you look at what happened to Tyler Van Dyke last season, great 2021, his numbers dipped, very poor 2020-22. I think Tyler Van Dyke was a victim of Josh Gaddis more than Tyler Van Dyke was a victim of Tyler Van Dyke. We'll put it that way. The new offensive coordinator, Shannon Dawson. Can he revitalize Tyler Van Dyke? Is Shannon Dawson the guy to put Tyler Van Dyke back into the production that he was getting back in 2021? Now, when it comes to their schedule, this is honestly a tougher schedule. Miami did get a tougher ACC draw. They have to play Clemson. They have to play Florida State. So they play the big dogs. And then you look at some of the games that, against the middle tier competition here, they got to go at UNC. They got to go at NC State. They got to go at Boston College, like you mentioned. Then they have Louisville. They didn't draw a lot of the weaker teams. I think the only weaker teams that they drew were Virginia and Georgia Tech. So when you're looking at this line here at 7.5, how much improvement can there be? I do expect bounce backs on both sides of the ball. Don't get me wrong. But can they get to 8 wins? I'm going to say it's more likely they get to 7 wins than they do get to 8 wins. So I'm lean under here at 7.5.
Well said, Shoob. Well said. You guys hit it on the nail with a lot of the points that you made. I do like the hire, the new offensive coordinator, new defensive coordinator. I like the coordinator hires that you guys alluded to. They have a lot of returning production, plus 8.5 TARP rating. But the offense was just terrible last year. But again, let's throw all that out the window. We have new coordinators in place. Miami's got some talent. That can certainly change in a hurry. In terms of their offensive line, they're 47th in line yards, 69th in sack rate. Ultimately, though, I like what they have on their offensive line. I know you guys alluded to a loss on the offensive line, but I really like the transfers they brought in. You guys didn't mention Javion Cohen, which I thought was interesting. So they've got 3 or 4 offensive linemen that I actually really, really like starting this year. So I'm actually expecting their offensive line to actually be a little bit better than it was last year. I actually have high hopes for their offensive line. Their wide receiver room is not really one that excites me. They don't really have a lot of elite weapons for Van Dyke or anything of that nature. Their running back room doesn't really excite me, although they do have one promising freshman who was highly touted in Mark Fletcher, who I think will end up taking the role later in the season. And I think he could end up being a really good player for them. One wide receiver who's not a projected starter, but I think will end up working his way into a very, very prominent role into the Miami offense is Robbie Washington, who comes from a very dominant pedigree. I mean, his father had 5,700 yards in college, and his cousins were drafted to the NFL. So dude's definitely an athlete by all measure. The offense, I think, can only improve, right? I think Gaddis absolutely tanked Tyler Van Dyke. I know I'm not crazy about the wide receiver options, but there is some potential in that group. I think there will be a good offensive line. In terms of running back, I'm not crazy about their projected starter, but I do think they have some really good guys in that room that could come in and make an impact. Mark Fletcher being the guy that really sticks out to me. Their defense, they're running that 4-2-5. I mean, Lance Guidry had the 15th most efficient defense last year with far lesser talent. I think that speaks volumes for what he can do for the Miami Hurricane. Cameron Kitchens is returning. I know Gonzo mentioned him, but I did want to mention that he is one of the most elite pass coverage safeties in all of Power 5. They also return a lot of their great defensive line guys. I know they lost some guys to the portal in the NFL, but they're going to have a formidable defensive line, especially we consider that a lot of teams in the ACC have taken a step back on their offensive lines this year. So I think that's going to give them an edge in a lot of these situations, especially when you have some ball hawks in your secondary. I mean, their portal additions, Francisco Mauigoa, Devontae Brown, Brandon Dean, love them all. But I mean, they did lose Darrell Jackson, defensive lineman Darrell Jackson to FSU, and safety Avante Adams to Maryland. So there are some step backs, but ultimately, overall, I think Miami got slightly better in every facet of the game, if not, didn't get worse. So ultimately, I think they have nothing. They're only going to be an improved team this year. But just because you're improved in every level does not mean that you're going to hit your win total. So let's look at the schedule, because it's all about the schedule. Miami of Ohio, I've got them winning that game. Texas A&M, I have chalked up as an L, because Texas A&M, as you alluded to, Shoob, has more under the hood. There's more horsepower under there. And I think they've got much more potential to do something with that, and I think they will this year. Bethune-Cookman, Temple, wins, easy. Bye week, Georgia Tech, that's going to be a win off a bye week. UNC is definitely a winnable game, as we mentioned, just because UNC's defense is atrocious. And if the offensive line and the new coordinator can get something going for Tyler Van Dyke, watch out, UNC. You could find yourself losing to Miami right here at home. So that's definitely one that can stick out. Clemson, we'll see what Clemson looks like under Garrett Riley. I don't think they'll beat Clemson, but we'll see how they look in midseason form. Virginia is a win. And you guys are a lot higher on NC State than I am. I think they can beat NC State at NC State. I'm not high on the Wolfpack at all this year. And then at FSU, I think they lose. I mean, that's going to be a tough one. Louisville's a toss-up. And then I think they beat Boston College. I don't think Boston College is that good this year. So I'm a little different on you. I know you guys consider Boston College more middle of the tier. I consider them more towards the bottom, in my personal opinion. But with that being said, I think I like Miami for 7 to 8 wins, but I'm going to lean to the over at 8 wins.
Okay, so we get an over for the Hurricanes, a 7.5 from Xan. Gonzo and I are on the under at 7.5, both leans. So now let's head back up north to Pittsburgh. The Pitt Panthers sitting there with a line of 7 wins even. Pat Narduzzi, believe it or not, he's entering his 9th season there at Pitt. This team went 9-4 last year, coming off the heels of a very good 2021 season with Kenny Pickett. They had a first-round quarterback behind center there, and they won the ACC, the first time that a team not named Clemson has won the ACC in what seems like a long time. Pitt was able to accomplish that, and then they took a little bit of a step back last year, but still had a lot of talent, especially on the lines of scrimmage. This year, though, it's going to be a lot different looking of a team. The offense last year, it was the definition of average. Once again, when you talk about the definition of mid at the FBS level, that was Pitt's offense. They were 68th in offensive efficiency. The quarterback room, it looks a lot different than he did last year. Keaton Slovis, he left to go to BYU. I guess his girlfriend must have left to go to BYU as well. And then we have Phil Jurkovec from Boston College and Christian Vaillu from Penn State. Reading the tea leaves here, it appears that Jurkovec's probably going to be the starter. I think Jurkovec is the better of the two. We just haven't seen a lot of Vaillu from Penn State so far. I think Jurkovec will be the starter going into the season. And in my opinion, he is due for a bounce-back season. Last year, he had pretty much a disaster offensive line to work with at Boston College. That offensive line had defensive linemen playing up front there last season. They just got decimated by injuries, and I don't think Jurkovec's production nor his injury history should be held against him last year at BC. The running back room, they lose Israel Abanikanda, which is a pretty big loss. He averaged 6.0 average yards per carry, which is very good. He left for the draft.
20 rushing touchdowns.
20 rushing touchdowns. I mean, Anaconda was a workhorse. And then the receiver room. One of their top 2 leading receivers returns. I do see a red flag here in the receiver room. I don't know about you guys. I see a lack of depth here in the receiving room, though Narduzzi does like to run the ball a lot, so they don't use their receivers as much as they did, per se, with Kenny Pickett back then when they were running that offense. And then the offensive line. Only one starter from the beginning of last year returns, though 2 of the guys that are projected to start this year did get a lot of playing time last year, so you could say they do return 3 offensive linemen from last year. it was average at best last year. I had high hopes for the offensive line. It was still pretty solid overall, but we'll see if it takes a step back this year. I'd probably say it's average again. And then the defense. This defense lost 4 players to the draft last year. Very quietly, Pitt had some very good players. 22nd overall in defensive efficiency, and only 5 starters off that defense returned this year. The D-line was pretty solid. The D-line was top 15 last year in nearly every single metric. Pitt had a very good defensive line. Of course, Kalijah Cansey is the highlighter there that they lost in the first round of the draft. This defensive line is going to take a significant step back, a very significant step back. I mean, it is just hard to replace that type of production at a place like Pitt. They had some very, very good talent along the defensive line last year. The secondary, however, does return a little bit of experience, but they also took some losses to the draft, which are going to hurt the secondary. So overall, this was a defense that was very solid last year. I think it's going to take a step back. And then we look at the schedule here for Pitt. Their non-conference slate to open the year, of course, they draw Notre Dame away, which is tough, but then they got Wofford, Cincy, and then they go at West Virginia to open the year. Cincy and West Virginia, it's kind of hard to read. It really depends how you feel about Pitt. Those are games that I think they could win, or those are games that I also think that they could lose. So if you're being conservative here, you'll say maybe they split those games between Cincinnati and West Virginia, though those 2 teams are probably not looking too great themselves going into this year. So it really depends how you feel about Pitt. And then the rest of the schedule, I mean, they do play UNC, Louisville, at Wake, Florida State. They don't have to play Clemson, but then they got to end the year at Duke. Not necessarily the toughest draw, but not necessarily the easiest in ACC play. I expect a bounce-back season from Phil Jurkovec. I like Phil Jurkovec a lot, but the problem for me is the defense. I think the defense is going to take a massive step back. I mean, it just has to. You just can't replace that level of production at a place like Pitt. I don't know about you guys, but it doesn't feel like that this roster is, or I'll put it this way, I don't feel like that this offense is significantly improved from last year. And I'll reiterate, I don't feel like it's significantly improved. I feel like it's a little bit better, but I don't feel like the offense is that much better. And I don't think that's going to help negate the massive losses they're going to take defensively. I am a lean under here at 7 wins, but I'm not very confident in it. I think 7 wins sounds about right for Pitt.
Very good points you made, Shoob. When it comes to their offense in general, I actually expect Pitt's offense to be significantly worse this season. They lost, as you mentioned, Israel Abanikanda, 1,400 rush yards, 20 TDs, absolute workhorse. And it looks like their replacement for him is going to be either Rodney Hammond or the LSU transfer Derek Davis. There may be like a little bit of share carries there, but ultimately, most likely a step down. They also lost their stud wide receiver, Jared Wayne, who was a 1,000-yard wide receiver. At least Kanata Mumpfield is returning. They also added a transfer in Dejon Reynolds from the University of Florida. So they have some guys coming in to kind of try to supplement that. But anytime you lose a 1,000-yard receiver and a 1,400-yard, 2-1 touchdown rushing guy, your offense is definitely taking a step back. Even if you bring in your Kovic, I really think I don't know. I'm not very high on your Kovic. I know he's been riddled with injuries. I know he had one really solid season. But ultimately, I really don't see him as that much of an upgrade to Slovis. And their offensive line, I think, is going to be in slight regression. I don't think it'll take too much of a step back, but I don't expect them to be as good as they were last year. In defense, here's one thing I can say about Pitt. I like their secondary. They're returning Marquise Williams, who was very strong in pass coverage last year. They're returning their other cornerback, so 2 complementary pieces, and MJ Devonshire, who is also a very solid pass against the pass. So 2 very solid cover corners. They are also getting Donovan McMillan from the University of Florida at safety, who could slot in and be a good piece at the safety position. So I think safety will be a strong suit for this team, for sure. I think it will be the strength of their defense. But let's go back to what you highlighted, the significant losses on the defensive line. You already mentioned Kalijah Cansey, but they also lost Habakkuk Baldonado, great defensive end, but they're at least returning Deion Hayes, who is another integral part of that defensive line. So they at least have one component coming back. But then we look at the next level, Shoob. Gonzo. We look at the next level, the linebackers. I'm surprised you didn't touch on this man, Servocia Dennis. He left for the NFL, and he is part of the reason why their run defense was so amazing. He was rated one of the best run defenders by PFF the entire season. I think he was rated number 2 or 3 in the entire all of FBS. He is an absolute elite run stopper. They also lost Tyler Wiltz, which is another big linebacker loss for stopping the run. But luckily, they're able to retain Shane Simon, who is a projected starter this year, and Shane Simon's specialty is pass coverage. So I think they are going. He's an excellent pass cover guy, but he's not a good running rush stopper. So I think they're going to be porous against the run. But I think passing teams like UNC, Wake Forest, I think those teams will be susceptible to this team, and that's where the matchup will favor Pitt. But ultimately, man, teams with a strong run game are going to run it right through Pitt's throat. So that's something I really don't like about Pitt. So let's look at the line, man. Line of 7. They play Wofford, W. Cincinnati and West Virginia. Honestly, they could win both. They could lose both. They could split. I'm going to go conservative and say they split. UNC, I'm going to say is a loss, even though that they have a strength that plays to UNC. They may give UNC a game just because their strength is pass coverage. Virginia Tech, a probable is at Virginia Tech. Bye week, Louisville, probable. Wake Forest, I think they'll win that because Wake has lost so much and their only strength right now is really their passing offense, which plays to Pitt's strength on defense. So I think that really helps them in that matchup. I think they can beat Wake Forest. Lost to Notre Dame, lost to FSU. Syracuse is a probable. I think they can come out with that, though. That one's being played at Yankee Stadium, interestingly enough. And then Boston College, I think, is a win. And then an L at Duke to end the year. I'm thinking 6-6 is likely. And even if they win both those Big 12 games, that's 7. The line is 7. I'm going under.
Xan Shoob. I like Pat Narduzzi. I like the state of Pennsylvania. I got family there. And it's great going up there to see them. Hail Pitt. This is a 6-6 team. This is under. My main issues, of course, as we've reiterated, are the depth. He was 4-5 on the offensive line. And you've got guys like Blake Zubovic, who's a senior, Matt Goncalves, not to be confused with Gonzalez, Goncalves, a redshirt senior. And then, yeah, you got dudes like on the defensive interior, Tyler Bentley, David Green, Sean Fitzsimmons. Even on the outside, you know, Bam Brema, after Devon Hayes, you got Sam Okonolowo. But then after them, it's freshmen. And how I view Pitt and their schedule, they get to the bye week, and then after Louisville and Wake, they got to take on Notre Dame and Florida State. And that's where I think the depth issues might start themselves. Those are going to be meat grinder games. Those are their toughest opponents. And I think if they lose personnel, I don't know if they'll have enough to get to the finish line. I still think they're competent enough to make a bowl game, but I really do think 6-6 is probably a more appropriate label for this team going into this season.
All right. So we have 3-way consensus on the Pitt under at 7 wins. Not a whole lot of strong takes here, but a few leans across the board. So that is the third 3-way consensus we've had so far on this win totals pod. Florida State over 9.5, Louisville under 8, and Pitt under 7. 3-way consensus there. Let's wrap it up, boys. The final team here on the docket for part 1 of the ACC, none other than the NC State Wolfpack. Dave Doran comes in for his 11th season at NC State. This team went 8-5 last year. Xan, take us away.
So we've alluded to this as we've talked about it. You guys are higher on NC State than I am. This is where the fun is going to happen right here, because we get to have our variance in opinions here. So just based on what we've been hinting at, I think our win totals here is going to be different. We might have some battles here, but let's just take a look at the team here. They've got the offensive coordinator from Syracuse coming in, Robert Anae. I mean, Syracuse had a pretty decent offense. I actually kind of like that hire, but ultimately, look, man, they brought in Brennan Armstrong. I know a lot of people are kind of high on that. I really don't think he's that good of a quarterback. I know he had one tremendous season at UVA where he was just absolutely incredible, but he also had a lot of NFL level wide receivers. A lot of those guys are playing in the NFL right now, or they're on practice squads. A lot of those guys had very good careers. North Carolina does not have that whatsoever right now. I don't think, and Brendan Armstrong didn't have that last year despite having a bad O-line. I'll grant him that. But I don't think he's a very good quarterback. I really don't. I think he's very average, and I think he's below Jake Plummer average, as we were talking about for average. So, assuming he can at least be on Jake Plummer status, I think he's still not much of an upgrade to NC State's offense. NC State has Jordan Houston, Michael Allen at running back. They bring in an offensive tackle from Oregon, Dawson Jamarillo. But man, I mean, they lost their best wide receiver in the portal, and the returners that they have are very limited on experience and production. I'm not excited about the wide receiver room whatsoever. So, I mean, take it with a grain of salt. Brennan Armstrong is also an interception machine. He is not very efficient with his ratios, and I'm just not high on him, man. I'm not. Even if Brennan Armstrong throws 30 touchdowns this season, I bet you he throws 18 picks. And that's going to bode very poorly for NC State if that ratio ends up being what it is. They also lost Chandler Zavala, their guard, to the NFL, one of their best guards, and they lost their center to Grant Gibson to graduation. So they lost some of their best offensive line pieces, which I really don't like either. I expect a net negative result for the offensive line this year. I'm expecting regression. QB play is going to be similar to what it was last year at best. Wide receiver play is not that great. I don't suspect they're going to have that great of an offense. And of course, when we talk about it, Devin Leary leaving for Kentucky, he's not better than Devin Leary. I don't think by any estimation that their replacement for Devin Leary is any better than Devin Leary. They also lost their running back, Demi Sumo Carbagaye, to Kentucky as well, which is another big loss for them. And then Devin Carter is the wide receiver I allude to. He was their pass catch leader and yards leader, and he's at West Virginia now. So they are just completely taking a step back on offense. I don't have a lot of faith in this team from the offensive standpoint, despite bringing in a pretty decent offensive coordinator hire. Although, let's look at the defense. Returning, Aiden White, very good returner for them. Solid pass. He's their best coverage corner. He's returning. I like that a lot. They also have safety Robert Kennedy coming in from ECU, and he's projected to be a starter. Like that as well. All of their projected starters on defense are juniors or older, so they have a good stable of experience at the position. But they lost their best linebackers, Isaiah Moore and Drake Thomas, to the NFL, and they were both excellent run defenders. But especially if you look at PFF, they were both excellent run defenders. And just by the fact that they didn't get any significant replacements for those guys, I expect regression in the run defense as well. So, I mean, I am just seeing, when I look at NC State, I'm seeing regression. It's not a team I'm very high on. The secondary, I think, can stay at least consistent to what it was last year, because they are returning some good corners, some good secondary pieces, and bringing in some guys. But ultimately, I really, that's the one part of this team that I don't think took a step back. And when you have that many pieces taking a step back, it does not bode well for you. I think they got worse on both sides of the ball. So let's look at the schedule. At UConn. UConn's getting a little bit better. That could be tricky. I don't think that's a guarantee for them. I know you guys might have that chalked up as a win. I can see UConn early season, smacking them in the mouth. I can see it happening, man. But I have that as a probable, not a definite win or loss. I will lean towards a win for NC State. But UConn could definitely get that game, and it wouldn't surprise me. Then they're going to play Notre Dame week 2. That's an L. VMI, I don't even know what VMI stands for, like Virginia Mechanical Institution.
Virginia Military Institute.
Something like that. You know, they fix your car, and you play them on the weekend when you have no one else to play. And then, so that's a win. And then they're going to go at Virginia. That's a win. Virginia's terrible. But if there's any team, because I don't think Virginia's going to go 0-12. If there's any team that Virginia might be able to get lucky against, I think it's early season home game versus the very man who spurned them, Mr. Armstrong himself. I feel like there might be some motivation. The fans might want to win that game. So that might be a game that Virginia actually wins when they shouldn't win it. So that one actually have as a probable. But I do think NC State can win that. Louisville, I'm going to say, is an L. Marshall, probably a probable, but I'm going to say it's a winnable game. Definitely, I think I lean NC State on that game. Duke, I'm going to say, is an L because it's at Duke. Bye week, Clemson. They always seem to give Clemson a fight in the Textile Bowl, but L. I don't care if they're at home, L. Miami, I'm a little bit higher on Miami. We'll see how their new coordinator hires do, but I did mention how I like how Miami got better at every position, or at the very least did not get worse at every facet of their game. So that's something that I think bodes well. At Wake Forest, I think that's going to be tricky for them. I think Wake Forest will beat them. And then at Virginia Tech, I think is a probable, because I think Virginia Tech has a lot of good offensive weapons. So they might struggle to keep up with Virginia Tech getting a little bit better on offense. And then UNC, I'm chalking up as an L. So right now, I'm sitting there thinking that they're going to go about 6-6. So I'm going with an under on NC State. I can see 7-5, but I can't see 8-4. So I'm going under.
Xan, excellent takes as always. Looking at this Wolfpack team, there was one thing I was waiting for you to say that did not come to the forefront. I want to take you back to 2021. First normal college football season. We're coming off the COVID year. There happened to be a season where Brennan Armstrong, with his good buddy Robert Anae calling plays, threw for nearly 4,500 yards with 31 tutties and 10 picks. And I'm a man who says, when things get tough in life, sometimes you got to go back to your roots. You got to go back to the people who were with you when you were successful, as long as they're not that toxic. And I love Anae and Brennan Armstrong. It's fate. They find themselves working together again. And that is the reason that I lean over on this NC State Wolfpack. Robert Anae is really the sole reason I think Brennan Armstrong is going to be above average, very competent for the Wolfpack this year. I know you said you weren't high on the wide receiver room. I respect that. I'm inclined to agree, though I am intrigued to see what Dakari Collins from Clemson can do. I've been notified that Kevin Concepcion is one of those to be looking out for from a freshman perspective, but what he'll contribute in his first year is still yet to say. He is still buried on the depth chart, as well as freshman Javante Vereen in the tight end room. And who knows, the way NC State season might go, they might be on the field quicker than some think. And just highlighting some other personnel on the O-line. Yeah, you lose 2 starters. It's not a position group that wows me. You got Dylan McMahon at center. Derek Eason's going to be left guard fighting with Lyndon Cooper. Moving to their D-line. They do bring in 2 unique transfers. You got Jai Hibbler from Northwest Mississippi State Community College. Some of those JUCO guys really can pan out and make a difference, as well as Noah Potter coming in to compete for the D end position. And then just a couple backers I wanted to highlight, Devin Betty, Caden Fordham, and Jalen Scott. So that's probably going to be the mix of their starting linebacking core. But really, like you were talking about, that secondary. So that combination of Aiden White and Shaheem Battle is a very good 1-2 punch from a cornerback perspective. But after them is where it kind of gets a little dicey. And I think if something, unfortunately, if someone gets an ailment, you bring in Robert Kennedy from Old Dominion. You've got a couple other pieces in the wings, but I do think their secondary can be exploited if injuries were to occur, unfortunately. With this schedule, yeah, you are correct. I am chalking a game like UConn kind of more up as a win, though I will say they are more improved. And really, how I have it is I actually have, doing my math right, 6 slated wins. I really have like UConn, VMI, Virginia, Marshall, Wake, and Tech. I have those as in the bag wins. And my take on it is, can you steal me 1, really 2, so we can hit the over against Notre Dame, Louisville, Duke, Miami, UNC? It's more likely they get to 7 in my mind. That's why I'm on the push to over. But I really think that the Brennan Armstrong, Robert and I, lethal weapon combination right there would be the factor in the Wolfpack taking home 8 wins this college football season.
Well, a little bit of disagreement between you two on NC State. So I got to say here, I guess I'll be the tiebreaker. I agree with some points that both of you said. I liked what Gonzo had to say about Robert and I linking back up with Brennan Armstrong. I'm a believer in Brennan Armstrong. I believe in what he did in that 2021 season. I think that kind of similar to Tyler Van Dyke and kind of similar to Phil Dracovic, I think Brennan Armstrong was a victim of poor offensive line play last year, and he was a victim of poor offensive scheme last year. I think a lot of these ACC quarterbacks, like Dracovic and Tyler Van Dyke and Brennan Armstrong, were all kind of in similar situations last year. But there's one thing that both of you guys did not mention. There's one player that you guys did not mention that I think needs to be mentioned here, and his name is MJ Morris. I think there's a legitimate chance that MJ Morris,
backup QB,
the backup quarterback, I think there's a chance that he could be better than Brennan Armstrong. Now, I do like I said, I like Brennan Armstrong to be the starter. But the thing is, what happened last year when Devin Leary, who I'm also a big fan of, what happened last year after he got hurt midway through the season? NC State fans know this. MJ Morris came in and we thought, oh, they are toast. That season's, the bottom's going to fall out there. They're toast. MJ Morris came in. He actually did very well in relief. And if you look at his numbers, you look at his advanced metrics, I mean, you can make an argument maybe MJ Morris is the better quarterback of the two between him and Armstrong. But regardless of who starts, the one positive you can say about this quarterback room is that you have two very solid options to go to. If one doesn't pan out versus the other, I think there's a good chance that you have a guy to go to that can be a solid starting Power 5 quarterback. And when you're looking at win totals, that's a very good sign for a floor. So you may be thinking, oh, I may be leaning over here. Not so fast. I also like what Xan had to say about regression. If you look outside of the quarterback room, just look at the whole rest of the entire roster. I mean, there's just no way that this defense does not take a massive step back. It was 12th last year in overall efficiency. The linebacker last room that the Wolfpack had last season, that linebacker room was loaded. There's just no way you can replace any of those guys. I mean, put it this way. I'm going to lean under here. I see about 6 to 7 wins in the cards. I see a floor with this team because of two very solid quarterback options, but I also think that the regression bug is going to hit this team hard. I do love Anai and Armstrong and Morris, but that defense is going to take a step back, and I see 6 to 7 wins, so I'm going to say lean under. But, I mean, I could see this team getting to 7 wins pretty easily. I wouldn't be surprised by it. But I also would be surprised if this team doesn't make a bowl game. I think they have two very good starting quarterback options to get to a bowl game, but I'm going to go very, very lean under here with NC State. So with that being said, that'll wrap up part 1 of ACC win totals. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you for watching. We went pretty long this time. There's a lot to cover, a lot to get to. These are some of the top dogs in the conference, but hope you guys enjoyed. Leave a like on this video if you're watching on YouTube, and leave a review, leave a comment if you're watching or listening, I should say, on Apple Pods. We appreciate it. Hope you guys enjoy these very, very detailed and opinionated breakdowns. With that being said, Xan, ZKS, otherwise known as Gonzo, and Shoob, signing out. See y'all later. Have a great day.